There's a misconception out there that I want to dispel today, and that is that there's one singular type of research leadership role. This belief is evident in conversations I have with researchers all the time. And I call it a misconception because rather than a singular type of research leadership path, there are actually several research leadership roles. The problem is that research leadership is kind of a black box. It's very difficult to know what each of these roles entail, what their opportunities are, their challenges, the day-to-day activities, until you're actually in them, which of course makes it difficult to know which is right for you and to build towards that best match. My name's Loie. I have occupied many different types of research leadership positions, and I'm going to leverage my own experience as well as all the conversations I've had with research leaders on this topic to use this talk to, one, provide insight into what each leadership path looks like, the individual contributor, the hybrid role, and the people manager role, and then two, provide guidance on how to identify what's the right match for you and what you can be doing to build toward each of those different types of leadership roles at any point in your career. A common refrain I heard in my conversations with many research leaders was that we need to decouple leadership from management. We need to stop equating leadership with managing a team of researchers. The research field is no longer just marching along with a single career ladder towards people management. There are many other opportunities today, and decoupling research leadership from management opens up the opportunity to assume more of these leadership roles. In order to do this, though, we need to bust some myths. Particularly, we need to bust the influence myth. And the influence myth is that those with the most influence in an organization are people leaders, people who manage others. In my conversations, the research leaders I talked to often looked fondly back on the times that they were an IC for those who had moved on from such positions. They thought about when they were an individual contributor and how amazing it was to be there in all of the right moments to persuade and influence to make sure that research insights got acted upon. As Stephen Wengerowitz told me, it's a myth that all the influence lies with the people manager. Individual contributors are wildly empowered to have an impact on product and strategy. As I mentioned, there's three primary paths that I'm going to be focusing on. One, the individual contributor. Two, the hybrid or player coach. And then three, the people leader or people manager. UX research titles are kind of wonky, so it's hard to map specific titles to each of these, but the individual contributor is often the principal researcher or the staff researcher. The hybrid might be the lead researcher, and then people managers are often your research managers or research directors. An obvious analogy to this is a sports team. You have your player coach, and your coach. And while the job descriptions for these sometimes sound pretty familiar or similar, it's things like your role is to positively influence the product development process and roadmap through insights. Your job is to bring the data to help make decisions. This is true across all roles, but these are actually very different in practice. Ultimately, of course, you want to pick the role that you're going to thrive in, the role that you're going to leverage your skills in the most, and the role that you're going to enjoy the most. As Sarah Sled told me, before you assume a new role, before you transition, you've got to ask yourself, will I get enough of the activities I love in this role? And if not, am I okay giving that up? The problem is it's impossible to answer these questions without knowing what these roles look like. So let's open up that black box. Before we get into the differences between the roles, though, we got to talk about the commonalities, the things that every research leader must embody. First is technical research skills, the ability to execute on rigorous, valid research. This is a no-brainer. The second is the ability to turn findings into insights, into strategy, to really unleash the power of the research findings. Three is the ability to go off mute or to develop a point of view and to communicate it. Four is clear, linear communication. Number five is the ability to influence and persuade. You've got to be able to evangelize research and to ensure that research findings are put into action at all the right moments. And finally, number 6, knowledge of one's place in a larger ecosystem, an understanding of where research is situated amongst a cross-functional team. Now let's talk about the differences, because that's how we really start to tease these roles apart. I've outlined 6 major axes of difference between these 3 types of leadership roles. We're going to go through each one by one, but let's look at them at a macro level first. First, we have the sphere of influence, who you are influencing and having impact on the most. The second is how you'll spend your time, what your day looks like day to day. The third is level of focus versus breadth. Next is how you show, and just as importantly, how you feel impact. Then there's the primary challenges or headwinds of the role and the skills that are most leveraged. There's a lot of info here, so we're going to take each of these by turn. I've created a chart that outlines how these 3 roles differ across all 6 axes. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of information there. But my hope is that it's a useful reference for you after this talk to go back to use as you're thinking deeply about your career. I'll preview it in a moment. Just know that it's going to be available after. And what we're going to do in this talk is actually go through row by row and illustrate more concretely the differences between these different roles we're talking about. So now that we looked at that big preview, let's start with the first major axis of difference, the sphere of influence. At the individual contributor level, your sphere of influence is primarily your cross-functional team, the people you're working with day to day, designers, PMs, engineers, etc. You have a very high familiarity with the data because you created it. You're bringing the data to the table, and you're doing so in all of those micro moments, all of those many important conversations that happen around the project that you're working on. You may, but you may not be in all of the milestone moments, the product reviews, etc., but you're definitely in all of the day-to-day conversations. At the hybrid level, your sphere of influence is also the cross-functional team for those moments where you are yourself creating research. Your familiarity with the data, however, is variable because at times it's your own work, it's your own findings, and at other times you're engaging with research that you helped a managee or a mentee or somebody you're coaching to create, and so you have less familiarity with the data. And in terms of when you're in the room, it's highly variable because sometimes you're there for your own projects and sometimes you're there in a more of a coach capacity. We start to see a lot of difference at the people manager level. At the people manager level, your sphere of influence is the cross-functional leaders that are in similar positions to yourself, the people who are leading the other functions. The greater research team is also a sphere of influence. And then finally, you have your own researchers that you're managing or the people on your team. The familiarity you have with the research data is relatively low compared to these other roles. This is not something that you produced yourself. This is something that you may have coached or you may have been very hands-off in creating. And yet you're going to want familiarity with that data if you're going to want to be able to influence the strategy and what's going on in your organization. As for when you're in the room, you're not necessarily there for those micro moments. You're not necessarily there when it's very early in a project and there's a clear need to identify the right course of action for a research project. However, you're almost definitely there for those milestone moments where big decisions are being made in terms of stop, start, or continue. Next, let's look at how your time is distributed. At the individual contributor level, you have the most control over your calendar. I know it probably doesn't feel that way, but as you move towards people management more and more, you have less control over your calendar as things need to be canceled at the drop of a hat. You also have the most ability to carve out heads down time as an individual contributor. And while everybody needs heads down time, there's a greater awareness that individual contributors need that time to get into the work, to execute. So your heads down time is more defensible than in these other roles. So at the hybrid level, you're kind of in the middle. You have relatively less control over your calendar, although more than pure people managers. And you were able to carve out heads down time, but it's just not as defensible as an IC necessarily. And then at the other end of the spectrum, your people managers have the least control of their calendar and the least ability to carve out heads down time. Those I spoke to in pure people management positions said You live in 30-minute increments. Everything is a 30-minute meeting on your calendar, and you have to be okay with that. Finally, an important thing to note is at the people manager level, the people I spoke to estimated that the time they spend really engaging in research is only 5 to 15% of their time. This is very different than the hybrid and the IC, and something important to consider as you think about where you want to go in your own career. When it comes to level of focus or depth versus breadth, individual contributors have the most ability to focus into a single content area and go deep. People managers have the least, stretching across the most content areas, and then hybrids kind of in the middle. Next, let's consider how impact is demonstrated and felt. This looks pretty similar at the individual contributor and hybrid levels. Here, your impact is seen when the product roadmap and the decisions being made are infused by research insights. At the people manager level, impact looks a lot different. First, the expectation is that you're developing a very strong point of view about the experience and have in your mind and are able to articulate a North Star experience. That is impact. And then secondly, impact is having a productive and engaged team. And this is something that can be very hard for people in the transition from roles in which they're creating tangible research deliverables, especially in organizations that don't celebrate or measure employee engagement or productivity very well. It can be hard to go from having something that you can put your hands around that you've created to having your impact be shown in the productivity and what others create. Next, let's talk about the challenges or the headwinds that you're likely to face in each of these roles. At the IC level, one challenge that researchers often face and speak of is that they are not always included in all of those milestone moments. Sometimes decisions are being made in rooms that they are not in. That can be challenging for those who want to be in all conversations. The second major challenge is that your organization might not actually be set up to have a very good advancement track for individual contributors. I've spoken about the field moving more towards having multiple different kinds of leadership roles, but some places are farther along in that than others, and you might be needing to advocate for yourself and your own advancement. And then thirdly, the conflation of management and leadership that we talked about earlier is deeply ingrained. And this can manifest in some difficulty for some researchers in terms of validation, both external and internal at that IC level. At the hybrid level, it's really about avoiding the trap of having two jobs at once. Oftentimes you're wearing two very different hats and you might be measured up against a standard of somebody who's wearing just one hat, just the researcher or the manager. And as a hybrid, you're straddling the two of those. And hidden manager work is a common culprit in making that balance between the roles that you're playing very difficult. At the people manager level, the primary challenges, again, are demonstrating and feeling impact. It's a lot different than at those other levels. Secondly is you have to be a leveling force for your team. When things get hard, you have to be the one to bring calm and control and encouragement rather than get swept along in it. And the third challenge for people managers is staying close to the research, staying close to the insights. You know that you want to be very close to the research findings and know the data in and out in order to develop that point of view, in order to have that impact on what the company is doing. But that can be very difficult when you're doing all of these other things, and again, when you haven't produced the research yourself. Carving out that time is a challenge I heard of frequently. On a more positive note, let's talk about the skills that each of these roles most leverages. At the hybrid level, the ability to proactively identify what kind of research needs to be done and when is first and foremost. Secondly, the most successful individual contributor researchers are self-motivated and curious. And thirdly, successful IC researchers excel at unlocking that value of research, ensuring that the research findings have impact on what's going on. At the hybrid level, it's really about balancing between those two roles. The most successful hybrid researchers are finding a way to create that balance by carving out a specialization. One way to do this is to become a subject matter expert, either on a method or a content area, as a way to influence the research team and make more clear what their role as coach is. At the hybrid level, garnering trust needs to happen both at the level of peer and at the level of those that you are managing or coaching. And this can be especially difficult when you're in a position that potentially isn't formalized as a manager or coach role, but you need to garner that level of trust. Finally, at the level of people manager, you need to be able to identify the roots of problems and remove obstacles. Crisis management is another skill that is necessary, as well as scaling research capabilities and optimizing operations. And lastly, as everyone I talked to spoke of, the best people managers are those that are able to put self below others. Now that we've characterized these roles and we've gone deep into what each role entails, now we need to figure out which one is best aligned to the kind of research you want to practice. Titles have been deeply ingrained in us, but the easiest thing we can do is remove the titles from the picture, take them out of the picture, and think about which of these descriptions of these roles best exemplifies what leverages my skills and that I'm going to enjoy. As Sheila Thompson told me, best researchers have developed self-awareness. They are able to answer not only, can I do this job, but also, do I want to do this job? If just taking titles out of the equation isn't an easy exercise, isn't something that you think you're able to do right now, there are some other concrete activities that you can undertake to help you identify which of these roles is best matched to you. The first thing I'd recommend is to keep a diary, just for a week. Keep a diary, write down at the end of each day the activities you undertook and what your level of enjoyment was in each, what your emotions were after each. As you look through your calendar, how did you feel about the moments that you were heads down? How did you feel about the moments where you were deep into conversation with many different partners? That kind of information can be illuminating. The second thing is to look back at your performance reviews, both your self-review as well as the reviews that you have received from peers and maybe managers. That kind of retrospection can help to highlight where not only you saw your strengths, but where others see your strengths as well. And then finally, strike up a conversation. You can reach out to other people in the field at various positions, people who occupy all of these levels, to grill them about how they feel about their job and what it actually looks like on an hour-by-hour basis. You can do this in informal ways by reaching out via LinkedIn, or more formally by something such as UX coffee hours. You also want to strike up a conversation with your manager. Your manager can be instrumental in helping you to chart your career path, of course, and I hope you have the kind of relationship that you feel like you're able to do this. For the manager conversations, go in with a plan. You want to propose a plan, not expect the manager to provide one for you, especially not if you've given them little time to think about what the conversation is going to be about. Last thing you want to do is pounce on them with, I need a career plan. Jared Joyce is a big proponent of this. As he told me, consider what you want your career to look like in the short and long term. Then go to your manager with a proposal for how to get there. Once you have an idea of where you're headed, where you want to develop your skills into, and which role you want to advance to, you can start building those skills at any moment. If you see individual contributor as your ideal end goal, if you're currently in a role, an individual contributor role, where you have that ownership over end-to-end research, you can start experiment by putting on other hats, shadowing the designers, the PMs, etc. in your sphere, to get a better understanding of what their jobs entail, which will make you a better partner. If you don't currently have end-to-end ownership over a project, that's your first step. You want to embrace as many of those opportunities as possible, as well as experiment with activities outside the everyday course of executing research, like pre- and post-mortems. At the hybrid level, it's all about making time for coaching alongside your own work. The best way to do this, if you have the opportunity, is to manage an intern. If that is not available to you, you can also look for opportunities to coach within your team. Again, developing a specialization, whether it's a method or content area, where other researchers know they can go to you for that, and you can develop trainings and coaching opportunities, that provides a great platform for growing those skills. And then finally, people management. It's hard to replicate many types of people management or many components of the people manager job. You're not going to be doing performance reviews if you're not a manager. However, there are ways to dip your toes into people management in your company. Employee resource groups are a great way to do this, if those are something that your company has. And if not, you can also look for opportunities to onboard or mentor new researchers in your team. Your manager will gladly give you the opportunity to take control of that onboarding process. It's never too early or too late to take this ownership over your career and to move closer towards the kind of leadership role that is best for you. It's never too early or too late to move yourself closer to the type of role that is going to best align with your strengths and that you're going to most enjoy. If you're just starting out in your career in research, great. This is a great time to do this introspection and to identify a plan for moving closer to the role that's going to be best for you. Not just starting out, that's fine too. It's never too late to change course. I'm certainly evidence of that. You can go back and forth between all these kinds of roles. But moving intentionally towards the kind of role that is going to best leverage your skills and make you happiest is the most important thing you can be doing. So thank you for making the time today to be thinking about these topics, and I hope that you continue to invest time in yourself in the future. Thank you.